So today we are pleased to have as our speaker, Dr. Natasha Stavros. The topic is the wicked wildfire problem in the West. And it goes without saying that wildfires are posing an increasing risk to our lives, health, homes, and ecosystem. It used to be a tragedy for mountain communities, and it used to be a tragedy in the summer. But as we learned from the Marshall Fire, it's right at our doorstep on the Front Range. And it can happen with devastating consequences in any month of the year. We can choose to forget about wildfires, but they are not going to forget about us. Reducing risk and mitigating the impacts of wildfires is a challenging problem and includes everyone: fire departments, city planners, builders, utilities, insurance companies, just to name a few.
Hello, guys.
Natasha,
I'm one of the nurses. We have some visitors at the front desk, but they specifically wanted to check if you were okay having someone.
Dr. Stavros is a practitioner of innovation and change. She received her BA from CU in mathematics and computer science, an MS in environmental sustainability at the University of Edinburgh, and a PhD at the University of Washington. Dr. Stavros has worked with US Forest Service and NASA. At CU as a research faculty, and at Ball Aerospace. She founded, and I'm not sure whether you could say the word or not, Wicked Solutions, that helps communities solve complex problems. And when she's not at work, Natasha enjoys being a mom of a 2-year-old. And so please give a fine Boulder Rotary Club welcome to Dr. Natasha Stavros.
Is it all in this? Okay. All right. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you about the wicked wildfire problem of the West. There we go. So you may think that wicked wildfire problems is a cute and catchy title. It is, but it also has a lot of meaning. In complexity science, the word or the term wicked problem refers to problems that have no single solution. Now you may be wondering why there are problems that have no single solution, and that's because problems are often solved through decisions, and decisions have 2 ingredients. One of those ingredients is data. This can be quantitative, it can be numbers. It can also be qualitative. It can be your experience, it can be anecdotal, it can be knowledge passed from one generation to another. The second ingredient is values, and values vary from person to person. So just because 2 people look at the same data doesn't mean that they're going to value it and the outcome of the decision in the same way. And that is why when you have a problem with multiple stakeholders, you can have a wicked problem that doesn't have a single solution. And so that's very much the case for wildfire. The wicked wildfire problem is actually not fire, it is megafires. And they are becoming more common. So this is a chart that shows you from the 1800s until present. This is 30 of the worst burns since 1825, pretty regularly spaced. And then you see in the start of the millennium, they become much more common. So before we dig in, we really have to say, step back and say, okay, so if megafires are the wicked problem, what is a megafire? Sorry, there's a delay. Megafire is a socio-political term for the fires that matter. And there are several fires that matter. Big fires matter for smoke. What you see here is a chart that shows the fires, the fires along the west coast of the United States in 2020 during the summer of the pandemic when we were all shut down. And the amount of smoke that was generated from the west traveled all the way across to the East Coast, carried across the Atlantic and into Europe. So these fires can truly affect millions of people. Fires that happen near people matter. So they matter in particular for infrastructure and livelihoods. So what you see here is a chart that shows you the number of homes that are threatened within close proximity to fire. And you'll see that chart again in a minute. Fast fires matter for lives. In 2018, in November 2018, was the California Camp Fire. It traveled, also known as Paradise Fire. Soon after that, Donald Trump made comments about raking our forests, if you remember that. And so that fire became very famous, and it traveled about 80 football fields per minute. To give you a sense of just how big that is, that means the perimeter is literally growing 1 mile per minute. Now, it takes 15 minutes for the average wildland fire to be reported in the United States, and 45 minutes for fire management resources to be deployed to the source of that fire. And the best resources in the world, which are actually not here in Colorado, they're in Spain and California, their average suppression rate is about half a mile per hour. Okay, at this point, we're not talking about stopping the fire. What we're talking about is where do we evacuate, what assets need protecting, and what do we do to protect them. So these are the fires that we would call mega fires and are associated with the wicked problem. And fires have 3 ingredients. And the reason I say they're a wicked problem is because these 3 ingredients are all controlled by different people and different contributors. So what you see here is that independent of the scale of fire that we're talking about, whether we're talking about a candle at your home or fires across the landscape, they always have 3 ingredients. For today, I'm going to focus on climate, ignitions, and vegetation because that's fires that happen over decades over large areas. So climate, and particularly climate change from greenhouse gases, which is emitted from fossil fuels, is creating warm, dry, and windy conditions. And what you see here are projections of warm, dry, and windy conditions out into 2050. And you can see that it's only getting worse. So the more intense colors, the more dry, hot, and windy it will be. Sorry, this is very slow. And in this analysis, we showed that just due to warmer, drier, windier conditions under climate change, we expect large extreme fire events to increase by 2 to 3 times or 300 to 400%. That's only one of the ingredients. Another ingredient is fuel. Now, you're gonna have to move my window. So fuels and fire suppression. Now you may have heard, yeah, but it's not just climate, right? It's about how we've been managing the lands, hence Donald Trump's comment about raking the forests. Well, fuels and fire suppression, we can actually see here in this chart, which shows you burning over 3,000 year period. And we do see that it actually relates with solar cycles. So unfortunately, it doesn't look like the lines are showing up. You can see there's a normal periodicity to burning that we do expect. But we can also see that when we look at the medieval warm period, we see increased fire. And then when we look at the Little Ice Age, we see a big dip, right? So there are other climate forcings beyond normal solar cycles. We also know that during this time in the Little Ice Age, Europeans colonized North America. And with it, they brought disease that was new to indigenous people. And these people, indigenous people, had been stewarding the lands and using fire on the landscape for millennia. And when they died, no one was introducing fire to the landscape. This leads to fuel accumulation, and the climate began to warm. So we have what we are experiencing today, a warming climate and a lot of fuels. And so then fire started to happen, and they killed people, and they burned down homes, and people were afraid. And with fear, they adopted policies of fire suppression. And later, in the 1950s, North America, United States, learned that that ecosystems actually needed fire. And they wanted to introduce fire back on the landscape. But by the 1970s, we had the Endangered Species Act protecting habitat. And by the 1990s, we had the National Ambient Air Quality Standards protecting our air. And this created a lot of bureaucratic red tape, making it harder to prescribe burns and resulting in a lot of fuel accumulation. So no one actor there. We do know this all leads to fuel availability, and studies have shown that when we look at fuel accumulation effects on how fast a fire can move, we can actually see in this chart, this is the 2014 California King Fire. What you see in blue is the fuel amount that we had when the fire happened, and that matches the perimeter that we ultimately saw. If we had had half as many fuels, that's how the fire would have been, right? So if we had actually prescribed burns on a regular basis and cleared some of that fuel out, we could have actually had a less severe fire in this case. Now, why is it that this matters so much, and particularly in steep terrain and mountains? And that has to do with the basic physics of thermodynamics. So hot air rises, and as hot air rises, cool air comes in, and that allows your candle flame to dance. Something similar happens on the landscape, especially when you have steep slopes. So you have fire, and it comes in, and it's warming everything above it, drying all the fuels that may not have been ready to burn, but are now ready because they've been under very, very dry conditions, more flammable, and it travels upslope. We also know that climate affects fuel accumulation, so it's not just humans and their land management, but to dissect the Marshall Fire for you, early in the year, we saw abnormally high snowpack acting as a water reserve to initiate the growing season. And then we saw abnormally high rain at the start and during peak growing season, which ultimately resulted in fuel accumulation in the Front Range on the order of 27 to 70% more than we normally would experience. And then we saw extreme drought. 3 feet of snow deficit dried out our grasses, leading into the new year, where we had a 6,000 acre grass fire under 120 mile per hour gusts and 30 mile per hour sustained winds. We stood no chance. So climate and fuel accumulation can also affect condition, and the condition of these fuels can also affect how fires behave. So in this picture, what you see is the Woolsey Fire in California. And what you see on the top is 4 years of sustained drought leading to mortality. The color that you see on that top plot are cells that have greater than 75% mortality in their vegetation. And then what you see on the bottom plot is a burn scar, where red denotes where you have more severe fire. And so that, what you see is a correlation between what dies and what burns. Fuels are also affected by suburban sprawl in 2 major ways. One, through invasive grasses. Invasive grasses are extremely flammable, and they burn much more frequently than native grasses. Why is this such a big deal? Because if you're gonna burn, and then you burn again, and then you burn again, you are depleting the native grass seed bank that you have, making it such that those native grasses are not going to come back. You will only see invasives, and they will only burn more frequently. Furthermore, suburban sprawl is actually changing the fuels that we have, not only through our gardens, but in the actual materials that we use to build our homes. And this results in all kinds of toxic chemicals. After the Marshall Fire, there was toxic air. They were asking people not to go back, not to clean up unless they had proper training. This all runs off into our waterways. So this affects us in very serious ways. The third ingredient is ignitions. And it's important to recognize that people actually start most of the fires that matter. So this chart you saw earlier, and if you move my little screen again, I'm making you do a musical picture. you can see this color bar on the lower left, and what you see is that all these red dots, those are greater than 90% human ignitions. And the dots that you can actually see from your seats represent 10,000 homes that are affected. Human ignitions can be a cigarette, they could be a chain hanging off the back of someone's car, they could be a mechanical piece of equipment out in the field that hits a rock and creates a spark. It can be a baby gender reveal party or fireworks. What we're also seeing is that humans are affecting the amount of time that we see fire on the landscape. So what you see in this chart in blue denotes fires that we see from lightning. It's a very concrete part of the year. But when you look at the red, those are human ignited fires. They happen all year. We can't stop. And that's why Marshall Fire is a big deal, because it's all year. Now, that big peak that you see around day 165, that's 4th of July. So support your local drone show. So when you put all these ingredients together, the fires that matter, or mega fires, are the ones with very high fire risk. This term, fire risk, is actually a very loaded term. We think of risk, sometimes we simplify it to just thinking about hazard. But let me remind you of the last 4 years of our life during COVID. COVID was the COVID virus was a hazard, but we were not all equally vulnerable, and we were not all equally exposed, and therefore we did not all have equal risk, right? And the same thing is true with fire, right? So we are not all equally vulnerable and exposed to fire in the same way, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So what can we do about this? It is not doom and gloom. The first foremost thing that we can do is we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels. And then there's a lot of other things that we can do. These other things are not going to make as big of an impact as reducing fossil fuels long term, but they will help protect our communities in the short term. One of those is building better. This is thinking about zoning, where we allow people to build, and the codes that we have, the home and community hardening, what we call home hardening. Now, this is really important because we have flood zones. We do not let people build in certain flood zones. We do not yet have fire zones. And California has recently lost a bunch of insurance companies who refuse to insure people. So it is only a matter of time before states have to start taking the insurance on for their people, because people will not be able to afford the insurance anymore on their own. Reduce human-caused ignitions. So believe it or not, our electrical grid causes, at least in California, I can tell you, the electrical grid has caused 1/3 of all of the major fires that they've experienced in the last 20 years. And that's because you just have a down power line in the middle of nowhere. It takes a long time for you to see it and do anything about it. By then it's grown. So the more we can move to networked microgrids and retrofit our infrastructure to support sort of localizing our energy sources, the better. We can reduce hazardous fuels. We can do this through prescribed burns, which requires developing a holistic framework for smoke, habitat, and fire mitigation. And we can have migratory herbivores. So you've seen the goats around town, let's have more goats. Goat milk is actually good for people who are lactose intolerant. So there's added benefit there. The last point on here is serve environmental justice. And this really goes to the point that risk includes vulnerability and exposure. So this is a great analysis by Headwaters Economics. Across the entire United States, when they look at areas of people who are in areas that are affected by fire, there's 37 million people. And of those 37 million, 880,000 families are in poverty. 5.7 million of those people are over the age of 65, which means they may not be getting notifications in the same way as our younger generations. They may not access information in the same way. Right? They may move slower. They may need additional support to pack up their car, to move. Similarly, 4.4 million people have disabilities. 19 million people are of color or Hispanic. 2.5 million people have difficulty speaking English. So when we think about, well, we'll put out an advisory, we'll have educational resources. Are we doing that all in English? Because there's a good portion of the population that we're not accessing. 790,000 households are without a car. That means they are reliant on public transportation to move around. That means if there is an evacuation, they are dependent on those public resources to evacuate. And there's 900,000 mobile homes. So a really important part about thinking about fire safety is thinking about our community as a whole. My concluding thoughts is that fire is what connects all of us. There have been studies that have shown that fire is what made humans human. Fire is what allowed us to cook our food and made our food nutrient dense and calorific enough to support the evolution of our brain the way that it is today. And so that is something that we are all connected by. Understanding the history and true nature of the wicked wildfire problem is the first step to acknowledging injustice and not repeating the mistakes of our past. Mega fires are the wicked problem, and there are actually good fires. So this is a prescribed fire that you can see here, and if you watch the video, you'll see a not prescribed fire, and they look very different. Building resilience includes everyone in this room, talking to your neighbors, talking to your HOA, working with your community, talking to your local and state government, utilities, land managers, landowners, etc. So I do want to end with a couple resources and things that I think would be very valuable to you. One of them is, this is the Wildfire Partners Program hosted by Boulder County. They are offering rebates for you to do home hardening in your local community. They will also come out to your house and do evaluations. I have asked them to come out and do an evaluation for my homeowners association because they're redoing their design guidelines. There's all kinds of ways for you to get plugged into the community and the knowledge that we have that's at a local scale. These are some of my favorite resources. There's an app you can download on your phone called Watch Duty. It is a not-for-profit app, so it's completely funded by donation. I get no money from any of these resources, by the way. And what I love about Watch Duty, I'll show you what the interface is in a second. Actually, I'll just walk through them. So Watch Duty, it looks like this little fire icon. It has all the fires across North America. It combines satellite data, and it pulls data from all the social media platforms. So even if you're not on Twitter, you get updates from people who are posting on Twitter, which is lovely. They also pull from the local incident report teams, and they put it all here, and you can click this little button that says, I actually want notifications about this specific fire that's happening in my neighborhood. Really highly recommend this source. This is one that if you're kind of like me and you want to geek out, you should totally go and enjoy this website. It's called Fire Map, and it's sdsc.edu. And I'm happy to share these slides as well. It's a really fun place where you can go and look at all of the different things that I talked about affecting fire. And you can look at real fires, and you can look at how local wind conditions are, and where was there a fire in the past, and do you think it's likely to go there? And I can tell you that, based on my knowledge, I can usually tell you exactly where a fire is going to go based on looking at all of these different data resources. So you may find it a fun thing to look at if you're watching a fire somewhere and you want to see what's happening. This is the official US government resource for getting incident information. This resource is not updated quite as frequently, usually every 24 hours, sometimes every 48 hours. But it is the official source of the information. And I will say to you that local fire departments, state fire departments, and federal fire departments report into this system, right? So if it's a really small little local house fire, it won't go in, but anything that's got significant wildland engaged in it, it will go into this database, and you can find incident reports on it. I love this website. This is the website that Home Economics, Headwaters Economics did their analysis on vulnerable communities. You can go in here, you can look across the entire United States, and you can look at direct flame risk. You can also look at smoke risk. So they're looking at how air moves around in the mountains and things like that to tell you whether or not you have high smoke risk in your area. And then this is just another fun website that I really highly recommend if you're interested or have followed any wildfires from overseas. North America is not the only place that burns. South America, across Europe, Algeria has had a lot of really big fires in the last couple years. If you're interested in any of those, this is a great international resource, and it pulls data from all of the satellite assets, and you can look at everything from how big the waves are going to be for surf to the air quality that you have. And so if you're ever wondering like, hey, these fires seem really bad, I wonder if they're going to get over to Europe. Or if you have family on the East Coast and they're complaining about smoke, you can come here and you can actually look and see the smoke plumes and see where they are and see if they're affecting that community. So with that, I will take questions.
Natasha, I have a couple of questions. The first one has to do, you mentioned prescribed burns and how difficult apparently they are to affect. So who are the big burdens or hurdles to have more prescribed burns? So that's number one. Number two, while you're answering that, think about, are there any countries in the world who are doing this job that in a way you admire?
Yeah, so those are two really good questions. So the first question of kind of what's hindering it. So the challenge is that when it's a wildfire, it happens and we live with the consequences. When it's a prescribed fire, we have to prove that what we're doing has positive environmental impact and that it's not going to get out of control. And so those are some things that can really add to it, especially when it's such a dynamic environment. The environment today may be very different than the environment tomorrow. For example, if you wanted to prescribe a fire in an area next to old growth, that old growth may be habitat for an endangered species. One day, the fire may not go anywhere near there. The next day, the conditions could be totally different, and it could go there. And so it can be really challenging to say, okay, this is the area we want to burn, and this is the exact time and exact conditions that we can actually burn it. And then we have to have the resources available, because a lot of prescribed fires can only happen when active wildfires are not happening, because we need those resources. So it's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation. Like I said, it's not really any one person that you could point to as being the problem. I actually think that one of the best things we can do is get everybody in the community to embrace prescribed fires as being a good thing and asking their community to think through how to do it. Because one of the biggest things that actually stops prescribed fires is the fear of public perception. And you saw that happen in New Mexico. There was a prescribed fire, it got out of control, there was a spot fire, and then it was a huge fire. And then right after that, they shut down all prescribed fires in the US Forest Service. And I will tell you that that happens 0.03% of the time. So we took that 0.03% of the time and we used it as an excuse to shut down something that was very constructive. And so that's really, it's us. We need to not be afraid of prescribed fire. We need to embrace it. We need to encourage our communities to figure out the resources to do it. The second thing is, when you ask about which countries are doing it right, I would say that a lot of countries that are predominantly indigenous owned and led do it better than countries that have been colonized. And that is because those people lived on that land long enough to know that the land needs it. When I was in Africa, I saw it all the time. Prescribed fire on the roadside, no big deal, right? Just on the grasslands. Australia has huge fires, million-acre fires for decades. Now they also have colonies and they're major cities, and so they suffer from some of the same problems we do.
Any more? just yelled out. Taking this to a very local level, what's the situation here in Boulder? Is it very dry? Are we prone to a problem?
Yeah, we are because we're a grassland, right? And we're a grassland that's changing, and our water dynamics are changing. Climate change, actually, one of the biggest impacts of climate change on the state of Colorado will be the change in how, when, and where we see water, right? Is it going to come in the form of snow? Is it going to come in the form of rain? Is it going to fall here? Is it going to fall there? What's the timing of that? And that all affects our fuels and our ecosystems. And so for me, at a local level, I think it's something that we have to start embedding, and I will give you some hope that Boulder County is, I've engaged with several different people across Boulder County to talk about this, both within the fire departments. That Wildfire Partners program is there to start building up communities, community understanding and knowledge around the topic. But I think we still have a long way to go. I think Boulder County just recently commissioned a wildfire resilience report asking for local Boulder specific actions. I don't know what's going to come of that, but I know that that's certainly in the works. So if it's a topic you're interested in, there are definitely ways to get engaged. I would say that one thing that can be really beneficial is being an educator of your local community. So I have become like the point of contact for everyone in my HOA when it comes to wildfire and they have questions. There's another woman in one of the local mobile home areas who's also become a local resource to her neighbors. And she just gathers all the information so that when they have questions, she has the answers to help them, right? There's little things that each of us can do to help educate everyone.
I was curious what took you to Edinburgh. So any chance you're on a Rotary International fellowship when you were at Edinburgh?
No. My mother's British. Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming. I have a question about, the burns on the grasslands. I've heard both that it's beneficial, but also that it burns the soil. And I think you made a comment about nothing can ever grow there again, at least nothing but weeds. Could you explain a little bit about when it's beneficial to burn and when it's not beneficial to burn?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So fire, the thing that really is the difference between good fire and bad fire in a very simplified way is that it's really about the impact that fire is going to have. And so the impact is determined by the frequency that you have the fire, how hot the fire burns, how continuous it burns. So if it were to burn out an entire area for a long range, it may be very far from any seed source to regenerate in that area, for example. So these are all factors that can affect what we call the severity of the fire. So in general, what you're looking for is low severity fires. Low severity fires have very low impact. They don't burn very hot. They tend to burn pretty fast. They'll burn quickly so that the heat's not sustained over a root system, for example, which will really hurt the root system. So they kind of burn fast, they burn quickly, they have a relatively small area, they may be patchy. Some areas may be a little more intense and other places may be a little less intense. There's just so much that goes into the variability of when it's good versus bad. But in general, the problem with the invasives is that it's just burning really hot very frequently, right? So a really good example, I grew up in Southern California in the chaparral. Chaparral wants to burn every 7 to 15 years. Invasive grasses may want to burn every 2 years. That may not be enough time for the chaparral to recover, right? So that's what I mean by frequency.
I think we have time for one more question. Thank you for your talk. At the beginning of it, you mentioned that California and I think one other country had a much more rapid way to fight fires. Could you give us a little more background on that?
Sure, yeah, I mean, it's really simple, money. It's, they just put a lot more money into it. So it's, California and Spain have two of the best firefighting capabilities in the world. And it's just because they have a lot more money, both for staffing, but also resources, fire trucks, helicopters, you name it.
Actually, I lied. We have one more question.
In southern Colorado, there is the proposed development of a national park. For such a proposal, are you all, is fire mitigation, fire prevention brought in as part of the planning? And if not, why not?
That is such a good question. Sometimes, yes. I think usually when you do something like that, they have to propose an environmental impact, which probably would include fire. I know that I actually have a graduate student that I work with at CU who's getting her PhD, and she's explicitly looking at the boundaries, so like forest land that borders tribal lands and federal land, and they don't talk to each other. And so I'd like to say yes, fire is. I have not personally consulted on anything like that, but I'd have to look into it. I think it would be certainly included the level of depth. I'm not sure though.
Dr. Stavros, right? Thank you for coming here today. We really appreciated you giving us a talk. All of us Rotarians take on wicked problems every day. One of the wicked problems we take on is actually wildfire ready, and we have a website too. I didn't notice it on your chart, but maybe next time.
I didn't include it, sorry.
But all of you know about it. Anyway, one of the other wicked problems that Rotary has taken on in the world is trying to eradicate polio. And to thank you for coming here today, and in your honor, the club is going to donate 100 doses of vaccine to the Polio Plus Fund. So thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you.